Modernity, an ambiguous term that may be used to describe changes in Latin America during the 19th century. Whether modernity defines economic, social, or political reforms, it does seem to be based on European and North American ideals, those that have never quite thrived in Latin America. The export boom as modernity. Porfirio Díaz. Under Díaz's regime, Mexico gleamed modern. Railroads, canals, and roads expanded across the country, exports grew, and the economy boomed. This was the time to be living in Mexico if you were male, bourgeoisie, a large firm, or a foreign investor. Díaz made sure Mexico was stable at all costs. But as we often see in Latin American history, one's stability comes with another's instability. There was national economic prosperity at the cost of individual vitality. According to the numbers, Mexico was a very modern society. 1,500 miles of railroad, 85 billion pesos of silver production, and 3% annual growth in the economy. But to women, this progress looked much different. Mexico experienced a particular type of modernity and progress, one in which women were largely excluded and marginalized. In this, we see the emergence of Latin American feminism. The Western liberalism that promised equality under the law excluded minorities. Illustrated by photography, modernity was experienced in complex and limiting ways. There was an intersectional blow to racial minorities, women, and agricultural and urban workers. One branch of feminism, called socialist feminism, was critical to the feminist movement during the time of modernity. Socialist feminism linked the oppression of the worker to the oppression of women. Many women faced the realities of modernization not only as oppressed women, but also as oppressed workers. The emergence of feminism in Latin America coincides with the entrance of women into the industrial workforce in the late 19th century, providing support to the socialist feminist analysis of the oppression of women. However, like much of recorded history in the time, it ignores the differing experiences of indigenous women and black women. In our presentation, we will focus on the position of non-racialized women in modern Mexican society with reference to class. Their position in society exemplifies the theme of modernity without liberalism. Working women. While working women were an essential component of the industrial workforce, they faced intense gender discrimination. Working conditions in Díaz's industrializing Mexico were oppressive and dangerous for all workers, but women had a unique experience. Many were moving in and out of their jobs to tend to their families' needs. Factory owners were wary to employ married women or women with children, some even going to the extent of administering virginity tests. The chastity of their female workers was important to these men, a traditional notion in a modern society. Another type of blue-collar female worker developed in this export-based society. Women found jobs in areas such as ports and mining camps to work as cooks, seamstresses, maids, and prostitutes for the predominantly male population. Women entered the workforce in a way that was non-threatening to her male counterpart. While there were few women who pioneered the field of medicine and one in law by the end of the century, this was exceptionally rare, and their positions were limited. With the flood of women to the public sector, inequality became more obvious to these women. Thus emerged feminism. Women in the family. During the export boom, while Mexico seemed to become more modern, women in middle-class families were faced with a more traditional role. Their previous roles in the family businesses were no longer necessary, as large firms dominated small businesses. Activity in the public sector during the independence movements of the early 19th century shifted back to the private sector under Díaz. Opportunities for education were scarce, and if a woman were to be formally educated, her studies were superficial and primarily used to give a good face to her family and to carry out a polite conversation. Civil codes were enacted by liberal leaders throughout the 19th century and early 20th century in Latin America based on European Enlightenment ideas. With the Civil Code of 1970, married women were legally obligated to obey their husbands. Under Díaz, the Civil Code of 1884 deprived a married woman her right to private property. In fact, widowed and singled women faced the greatest amount of liberty with the social cost of living without a man. Latin American society in the 19th century seemed to favor authoritarian figures. Just as Díaz took a strong hold of the country, man took a strong hold of the family. Granted, these gender norms can still be seen today, along with the continuing trend of authoritarian leaders across Latin America.
By the end of the 19th century, photography had been playing an important role in documenting combat, regional conflicts, and the process of modernization. Extensive railroads made it easy for photographers to navigate Mexico. Mexico was one of the first countries in Latin America for photography to prosper. Díaz knew the importance of photography as a means to publicly show off progress in Mexico. With Mexico's increased international recognition for production, it was important that Mexico to look the part as well. Díaz ordered photographers to take photographs of railroads and tall buildings, illustrating his modern society. In doing so, he was able to gain public support and justify his rule, however corrupt or brutal it was. He was drawing in foreign investors, making it appear as though he held a stable, democratic society. We see now that this society had the look and feel of modernity, but was not as progressive as the photographs depicted. Photographers such as William Henry Jackson observed engineering projects such as telephone lines, dams, and railroads, which are indispensable to a modern nation. We see photography repurposed after the reign of Porfirio Díaz at the beginning of the 20th century during the period of Mexican Revolution. From being used as evidence of modernization to a way of documenting a different type of progress, one moving away from the oppressive rule of Díaz. Photography was not only used to show the process of modernization in Mexico, people used it to prove that they were part of the civilized society and that they no longer had any connections with indigenous traits. One of the best examples was the photograph of Benito Juárez, the president of Mexico. He was Zapotec origin, but hoped to effectively erase his indigenous past by portraying himself as a modern man through photograph. By erasing his indigenous past, he was able to climb the social hierarchy and participate in modernized Mexico. The photojournalist Agustin Victor Casasola took photos of important figures in the revolution, such as Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa. He traveled along with troops and photographed the ordinary lives of soldiers, including their families. However, he also shot the grim parts of the war, including images of execution. This was a stark contrast to the previous portrayal of modern Mexico.
The process of modernization was a complex one that still continues today. Its dimensions are easily described using Díaz's Mexico. Varying experiences are communicated through the lens of 19th century photographers like William Henry Jackson. While Mexico experienced sustained economic growth and a boom in exports, the patterns of everyday life remained traditional under this authoritarian leader.